The man known to history as Gordon of Khartoum was born Charles George Gordon on the 28th of January 1833 in Woolwich, a district in southeast London best known as the home of the Royal Military Academy, where officers of the Royal Artillery and the Royal Engineers were trained for the British Army. His father was Henry William Gordon, an artilleryman and veteran of the Napoleonic Wars who rose to the rank of Major General. He came from a family in which 4 generations had served in the British Army. His mother was Elizabeth Enderby, who was from a family of whaling merchants who started off mainly trading in New England, but after the American War of Independence, the Enderbys sponsored expeditions to Australia and New Zealand. The 31-year-old Henry Gordon married Elizabeth in May 1817. She was 6 years his junior. Following her marriage to Henry William Gordon, Elizabeth would have 11 children over a 20-year period from 1818 to 1838, of whom Charles was the 9th. Charles Gordon grew up during a time when the British Empire had established itself as the world's superpower. After the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, which ended more than 2 decades of conflict between Britain and France in the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, Britain and its mighty Royal Navy managed to gain control of the international trade system for the best part of a century. The empire reached its heights under Queen Victoria, who came to the throne in 1837 following the death of her childless uncle, William IV. Although primarily motivated by a desire to increase the wealth of the empire through trade and commerce, the British were also known to use their military power to defend the interests of fellow Christian nations or to help preserve the European balance of power. In 1827, the Royal Navy joined the French and Russian fleets in defeating the Ottoman Turkish fleet at the Bay of Navarino, paving the way for Greek independence in 1829, though the increasing influence of Russia in the Balkans at the expense of the Ottomans was to be a cause for concern in the coming decades. Further to the east, Britain went to war in 1839 with the Qing Empire in China over the right to sell the addictive opium drug which the Chinese government had tried to ban. Gordon would see action in both Russia and China over the course of his military career. British military officers and their families were posted all round the world in the service of the Empire, and in 1836 the 3-year-old Charlie Gordon accompanied his father to a posting in Dublin. 2 years later, Henry William was promoted to lieutenant colonel and transferred to Leith Fort on the Forth Estuary near Edinburgh. In 1840, Colonel Gordon was moved to the island of Corfu in the Ionian Islands, which had become a British protectorate since the Battle of Navarino and would remain under British control until 1864. The Mediterranean climate was a pleasant change from the gloomy weather of the British Isles, and Charles and his siblings enjoyed exploring the island, thereby learning more of the island's ancient origins as the Greek colony of Corcyra, and its more recent existence as an outpost of the Venetian Maritime Empire until its conquest by Napoleon in 1799. The Gordon children also received lessons from an English tutor alongside readings from the Bible and other religious texts from their mother for 2 or 3 hours a day. Charles Gordon's Mediterranean stay ended after 3 years when, in 1843, at the age of 10, his parents decided to send him to school in England. Acting upon the advice of the children's governess, Miss Rogers, Henry and Elizabeth sent their son to a small school called Fulland's House in Taunton in Somerset, run by the governess's father and brother, George Rogers and the Reverend Herbert Rogers. Charles did not enjoy his studies at Fulland's very much and was a mediocre student, though he developed a talent for drawing and making detailed street maps. In November 1843, a month after Charles started at Fullands, his beloved sister Emily died of tuberculosis at the age of 17. Emily had been his favourite sibling, and Charlie later recalled that his life was never the same following her untimely death. In October 1845, Colonel Gordon returned to Woolwich to take up a post at the Royal Artillery Barracks. The following year, Charles returned home and attended a nearby school to prepare him for the examinations to the Royal Military Academy. After his return to Woolwich, he became closer to his sister Augusta, who, despite being 11 years older than him, would remain a close confidant throughout his life. Although the 14-year-old Charlie was initially indifferent to his devout sister's persistent efforts to strengthen his religious belief, he would later develop a strong Christian faith. On the 8th of July 1847, Charles George Gordon was appointed a gentleman cadet at the Royal Military Academy. The curriculum consisted of mathematics, fortification, history, geography, French, and German. Although he received good grades in French and fortification, Gordon developed a reputation for challenging authority. The Royal Military Academy had recently established a system of prefects, whereby older boys, given the rank of corporal within the academy, would instill discipline among the younger cadets. During his first year, after being ordered to walk rather than run out of the dining hall after meals, Gordon headbutted one of the senior cadets, knocking him down the stairs and through a glass door. He was placed in confinement and subjected to regular floggings from the school authorities and was fortunate to avoid expulsion. In the immediate aftermath of the incident, Gordon protected himself by seeking isolation from his friends and classmates, but after a while, his rebellious streak returned, and he was often heard making disparaging remarks about the officers during parades. By the time Gordon became a senior cadet, he had become a strict disciplinarian himself. He was due to graduate in 1851, but during an inquiry by the Board of Ordnance into bullying at the academy, Gordon was accused of beating a boy several times with a clothes brush and bruising his back. Though the inquiry recommended his dismissal, the academy authorities satisfied themselves by delaying his graduation by 2 terms or 6 months. As an expert in drawing, map-making, surveying and designing fortifications, Gordon hoped to become a military engineer or sapper. After passing his delayed practical examination in June 1852, the 19-year-old Gordon was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Royal Engineers. He reported to the Royal Engineers Brompton Barracks near the Chatham dockyard, and over the next 19 months was involved in the renovation and rebuilding of army buildings in the area. Despite his sister Augusta's attempts to find him a suitable Christian bride, Gordon was a shy and lonely young man who always avoided social events. In February 1854, Gordon was promoted to first lieutenant and posted to the garrison at Milford Haven, near Pembroke in South Wales. Although Gordon did not see much point to the refortification programme in South Wales, he enjoyed visiting the Pembrokeshire countryside and became friends with Captain Francis Drew, an infantryman of the 11th Regiment. Along with his wife, Anne, Drew inspired within Gordon a strong belief in Christianity. Gordon began praying and reading scripture regularly, writing to a delighted Augusta about how this religious transformation had made him happier in life. He was particularly influenced by St. Paul's teaching that, "For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain," which made him unafraid of death. Following the Drews' example, Gordon did not become a member of any church, but attended congregations of various Christian denominations, including Roman Catholic, Methodist, Presbyterian, in addition to the Church of England. For almost 40 years since the Battle of Waterloo, the British Army had seen little action. This situation was set to change when, in July 1853, Russian armies invaded the Ottoman Empire and occupied the provinces of Wallachia and Moldavia under the pretext of protecting Orthodox Christians in the empire. In November 1853, the Russian Black Sea Fleet defeated and destroyed the Ottoman fleet at the Battle of Sinope. Britain and France were afraid that the Russians might march all the way to Constantinople, also known as Istanbul, and intervened on behalf of the Ottomans by declaring war on Russia in March 1854. After trapping the Russian fleet at its base in the port of Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula, the British and French landed an army on Crimea in September and began to lay siege to Sevastopol. On the 25th of October, the British managed to repulse a Russian attack on its supply base at Balaclava, during which a failure of communication caused the Light Brigade of more than 600 men to charge into the so-called Valley of Death in the face of Russian cannon. Although the Light Brigade did manage to capture the Russian guns, the heavy casualties sustained damaged the reputation of its commander, Lord Cardigan, and the commander-in-chief, Lord Raglan. Gordon had hoped to see service in the Crimea, but at the end of November he was ordered to report to his childhood home of Corfu instead. After begging family friends at the War Office for a posting in the Crimea, on the 3rd of December he was given new orders to join a Royal Engineer unit mapping minefields in the Crimea, and arrived at Balaclava on the 2nd of January 1855. Lieutenant Gordon was soon at work on the siege lines around Sevastopol. Gordon's brothers, Enderby and Henry, were also serving in the Crimea, as was his fellow sapper Gerald Graham, a friend from the Royal Military Academy. Gordon would also become close friends with a young infantry officer named Garnet Wolseley, who would cross paths with Gordon frequently and end his distinguished military career as a field marshal. In addition to building trenches and carrying out mining operations, Gordon spent much of his time sketching the Russian fortifications in anticipation of a major Allied offensive against Sevastopol. In order to present an accurate picture of the Russian defences, Gordon often found himself exposed to enemy fire, and in late March he was struck by a spent ball fired from a Russian picket. On the 18th of June, the 40th anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo, the British and French infantry launched the offensive, seeking to capture the great Redan and Malakoff fortresses protecting the southern approaches to Sevastopol. Though Gordon expected the port city to fall within 10 days, the Russians mounted a successful defence, inflicting more than 1,400 British and 6,000 French casualties. The failed offensive is said to have contributed to the death of Lord Raglan on the 28th of June. Seeking to take advantage of the Allied setback, on the 16th of August, a Russian army of almost 60,000 men sought to attack the Allied bases to force them to abandon the siege. They were met at the Chernea River by almost 30,000 Frenchmen, along with 10,000 Italians from the Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont, which had joined the Allies in an attempt to obtain British and French diplomatic support for the cause of Italian unification. The Russian defeat encouraged the Allies to make a further assault on the fortifications outside Sevastopol in early September. In the aftermath of the first offensive against the Redan, Gordon remained in the trenches for 34 consecutive days, helping to maintain the condition of the British trenches and continuing to gather intelligence and make sketches of the Russian defences. On the 5th of September, Gordon witnessed the Allied bombardment of the two Russian redoubts, and on the 8th, the Malakoff fell to the French. Gordon accompanied the less successful British attack on the Great Redan, but after the French success at Malakoff, the Russians chose to evacuate the southern part of the city, blowing up their powder magazines in the process. On the 9th of September, the Allies captured the city after a year-long siege, effectively bringing an end to the war. In the meantime, Gordon joined a 9,000-man army which supported a naval action that destroyed the Russian fortress of Kinburn on the mouth of the Dnieper River on the 17th of October. After returning to Sevastopol, Gordon spent the next 4 months with his friend Gerald Graham mining and destroying what remained of the city's military installments. During this time, Gordon befriended Romolo Gessi, a military interpreter attached to the Piedmontese army. In March 1856, the Crimean War ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. For his service during the war, Gordon was awarded the French Légion d'honneur, the coveted Order of Merit established by Napoleon in 1802. As part of its terms, the Treaty of Paris established the Kingdom of Romania, an autonomous political entity within the Ottoman Empire. The treaty established an international commission to survey the new border between Russia and Romania. In recognition of his drawing and map-making skills, Gordon was appointed to the 3-man British delegation headed by Colonel Edward Stanton. In May, Gordon went to Romania with his friend Gessi, who planned to visit his widowed mother in Bucharest. Though Gordon could speak French to the Romanian elite, the polyglot Gessi served as an invaluable interpreter among the peasantry. From his base at the port of Galati on the Black Sea, Gordon spent almost a year mapping out the new frontier in Bessarabia, the region divided between modern-day Moldova and southwestern Ukraine. After the survey was completed in the spring of 1857, Gordon reported to the British Embassy in Constantinople, where he was assigned to a commission to demarcate the border between Russian Armenia and Ottoman Armenia. Accompanied by a half-Turkish, half-Kurdish officer in Ottoman service who insisted on being called Robert, Gordon charted the mountainous terrain and enjoyed a toboggan ride down the slope of Mount Ararat, the place where Noah's Ark is supposed to have landed at the end of the Great Flood. In addition to his detailed drawings, Gordon also used a camera to document the people and the terrain in Armenia, and he was elected to the Royal Society of Geography the following February for his work as a surveyor and photographer. After returning to England in late summer, he spent the winter with his parents, who had moved to Southampton in their retirement. In the spring of 1858, he returned to Armenia, where he and Robert were joined by a Russian officer, Colonel Kleb. While taking measures to keep the Ottoman and Russian officers as far apart from each other as possible, Gordon noticed that many of the stone cairns he used to demarcate the border had been removed by local farmers during his absence. By the time the work was complete again in November, several cairns had already disappeared, prompting Gordon to return to Constantinople begging not to be assigned such a task ever again. After returning to Southampton at the end of 1858, in April 1859, Gordon was promoted to captain and appointed second adjutant at the Chatham depot, serving under its commandant, Edward Stanton, whom he had worked with in Romania. Gordon served in this post for around a year, but became bored and petitioned the War Office to be assigned to active service in China, a request that was granted in July 1860. After the end of the First Opium War in 1842, the Chinese authorities ceded the island of Hong Kong to the British and agreed to open 5 so-called treaty ports to Western trade, though the opium trade technically remained illegal. In the 1850s, a further attempt by Chinese officials to suppress the opium trade led to the outbreak of the Second Opium War in October 1856. After an Anglo-French army captured the port of Canton or Guangzhou on the 1st of January 1858, the Chinese signed a peace treaty in Tianjin in June, opening up a further 10 treaty ports to Western trade, legalizing the opium trade, and allowing Western merchants and missionaries to travel to the Chinese interior. When hardline ministers in the Chinese court deplored the concessions and encouraged the Jianfeng Emperor to continue fighting, a second round of hostilities began in 1859 when the Europeans attacked the Taku forts near Tianjin. By the time Gordon arrived at Tianjin in September 1860, the Anglo-French army had captured the Taku forts and were advancing on the Chinese capital of Beijing. In early October, French and British forces arrived in Beijing and began looting the Summer Palace and the Old Summer Palace. After learning that several British and French officers captured by the Chinese had been brutally executed, the British commander, Lord Elgin, ordered the burning of the Old Summer Palace, and as a sapper, Gordon was personally involved in carrying out the operation. Although Gordon agreed with his superior that the Chinese deserved to be punished for their treatment of the prisoners, he lamented his part in the destruction of the palace. The emperor fled the capital and let his brother, Prince Gong, sign a convention with the British and French accepting the concessions made in the Treaty of Tianjin, thus ending the Second Opium War. After peace was made, Gordon and his sappers built living quarters for the occupation army that stayed in Tianjin for the next 18 months to enforce the terms of the treaty. The Qing Empire may have ended the war with the Europeans, but a longer and bloodier war was still ongoing. In the late 1840s, a man from the southern Chinese province of Guangxi named Hong Xuecha, frustrated by his repeated failures to pass the Imperial civil service examination, was inspired by Christian missionaries and founded a religious movement after identifying himself as the brother of Jesus Christ. Hong's teachings brought him and his followers into conflict with the Qing authorities, and in January 1851, Hong proclaimed the creation of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, with himself as Heavenly King. With more than 500,000 peasant soldiers in their ranks, in March 1853, the Taiping rebels captured the former capital of Nanjing on the Yangtze River, which Hong made his new capital. Aiming to capture the capital of Beijing and topple the Qing Emperor, the Taiping launched offensives to the north and the west in May. By October, the rebel armies had reached Tianjin, only 100 miles from the capital, but a successful counterattack by the Imperial army stalled the onslaught. With Nanjing besieged by Qing armies, the Taiping leadership began fighting among themselves, and Hong purged several of his senior lieutenants over the next few years. Nevertheless, in May 1860, the Taiping armies managed to break the siege of Nanjing and invaded Jiangsu and Zhejiang provinces, capturing the ancient capital of Hangzhou and the city of Suzhou by June. By the summer of 1860, the Taiping rebels were threatening the treaty port of Shanghai, a city of 300,000 which was home to a large community of Western merchants. Back in England, Gordon had been sympathetic to the Taiping cause due to its Christian influences, but when he stopped briefly in Shanghai en route for Tianjin, he witnessed the atrocities committed by the Taiping against the local peasantry and quickly changed his mind. The American sailor Frederick Townsend Ward organized a small band of 200 Western mercenaries armed with modern weapons to assist the Qing soldiers defending Shanghai. Over time, Ward recruited local soldiers to his small army which remained under the command of Western officers. After winning several skirmishes against the Taiping, in March 1862 the Qing government bestowed the honorific title of the Ever-Victorious Army on Ward's small force. The same month, Gordon was sent to Shanghai as part of a 1,000-man force led by his brother Henry's brother-in-law, General Charles Staveley, which would bolster the ranks of the ever-victorious army. Gordon arrived in Shanghai in May as the head of Staveley's engineers and began to examine the weaknesses of the Taiping defences, leading attacks to capture several fortified towns in the vicinity of the city. In September, Ward was killed at the Battle of Suji and replaced by fellow American Henry Burgvine. The new American commander alienated the Chinese, and in January 1863, Li Hongjiang, the imperial governor of Jiangsu province, proposed that Gordon should take command of the ever-victorious army. After receiving permission from the British government to serve under foreign command, on the 25th of March, the 30-year-old Major Charles Gordon took command of the ever-victorious army, whose ranks had swelled to almost 4,000 men. The ever-victorious army's immediate objective was to recapture Suzhou from the rebels. Within days of taking command, he sought to improve the discipline of the men by providing them with uniforms and conducting regular drills. Though Gordon's strict methods led to desertions from the ranks, he also added to his contingent by recruiting hundreds of dissatisfied Taiping soldiers. Gordon was critical of Chinese tactics to launch frontal attacks against the enemy, and with his detailed understanding of the topography, he sought to utilize the canal network in southern Jiangsu to support attacks at key strategic points in the enemy flank and rear. Assisted by a fleet of steamers and Chinese junks, in April, the ever-victorious army successfully recaptured the towns of Changsu and Taikang from the rebels. During both battles, Gordon exhibited considerable bravery under fire, and his inspirational leadership in the Taiping War would earn him the nickname Chinese Gordon in the British press. Gordon's instructions forbidding his men from looting led to mutiny on the 4th of May, which was firmly suppressed. Li Hongjiang was impressed by Gordon's integrity, considering him superior in manner and bearing to any of the foreigners whom I have come into contact with. At the end of May, Gordon attacked the town of Kunshan, which protected the eastern approaches to Suzhou. Gordon led the attack along the canal to Suzhou aboard the ironclad steamer Heisen, sending a force of 350 men to subdue the city while he sailed up and down the canal, blasting the Taiping defences. The capture of Kunshan opened the way to Suzhou, and the ever-victorious army began attacking the towns surrounding the city. In the meantime, the disgruntled Henry Burgvine had defected from the ever-victorious army and joined the Taiping defence of Suzhou. After Gordon surrounded Burgvine, the American tried to rejoin the Imperial forces, but another attempt to defect prompted Gordon to arrest him and send him away. With Burgvine out of the way, in November, Gordon negotiated a surrender with the Taiping princes inside the city after promising to spare their lives. Once the Imperial forces entered the city, Li Hongjiang went back on the agreement and ordered the execution of the Taiping leaders. Li's decision outraged Gordon, who believed that it would only encourage the Taiping to continue their resistance and spill more blood. The enraged Englishman refused to cooperate with Li, and when a messenger arrived bearing gifts from the Tongxi Emperor on the 1st of January 1864, Gordon refused to accept them. The refusal was considered a grave insult to the Chinese, and Gordon offered his resignation, but by February he repaired relations with Li Hongjiang and recognized that the Chinese general had implicit orders from the emperor to execute the rebel leaders. With General Zheng Guofan's Hunan army advancing against Nanjing along the Yangtze from the west, Li advanced on the Taiping capital from the east. As the honor of taking Nanjing would be reserved for the imperial troops, Gordon's men carried out the secondary objectives of subduing Taiping resistance at Yijing, Liyang, and Jintan, where on the 21st of March Gordon was wounded lightly in the thigh. After helping Li capture the major city of Changzhou in May, which restored imperial control over the whole of Jiangsu in June, Gordon disbanded the ever-victorious army. Shortly after the death of Hong Xuecha in June, Zheng's Hunan army captured Nanjing in July and executed the Heavenly King's teenage son and successor, putting an end to the rebellion. By the time of Nanjing's fall, Gordon was in Beijing to advise the emperor on the reorganization of the imperial armies. He made up for his previous refusal of the emperor's gifts by accepting the noble rank of Viscount, the title of Commander-in-Chief of Jiangsu Province, and the yellow jacket of the emperor's ceremonial bodyguard, which had never been granted to a foreigner before. Once again, he declined a gift of 10,000 silver taels, and likewise declined a substantial sum of money offered to him by Shanghai's grateful merchant community. Having already been promoted to lieutenant colonel in China, Gordon became a companion of the Order of the Bath in December 1864 while he was returning to England. The 32-year-old Gordon was uncomfortable with the fame he had gained in China and resented the journalists who gathered at his parents' house in Southampton upon his arrival. He was happier to see his old friend Romolo Gessi, who sought to recruit Gordon to General Giuseppe Garibaldi's campaign of Italian unification, but Gordon chose to remain at home with his sick father, who died in September 1865. That same month, he accepted a new post at Gravesend in Kent, where he would command the Royal Engineers in the construction of fortifications defending the Thames estuary. Although he considered the fortifications expensive and obsolete, Gordon nevertheless busied himself each morning supervising the construction works. During the afternoons, Gordon dedicated his free time to charitable activities which he considered part of his Christian duty. Although he had witnessed poverty and destitution in war zones before, he was surprised by the level of deprivation in the town. Encouraged by his friends Frederick and Octavia Fries from the local Religious Tract Society, he invited the local poor to summer parties at his residence at Fort House, serving plentiful amounts of food at his own expense. He taught geography and arithmetic at the local Ragged School for working-class children and allowed some of the poorer boys to stay for several nights at Fort House, ensuring they were well-clothed and well-fed. In 1867, he converted a couple of the reception rooms into classrooms and opened a night school, teaching up to 500 boys over 5 years. He is said to have spent 90% of his salary for charitable purposes and also donated a gold medal he received from the Chinese emperor. Although Gordon's charitable work did not come under any scrutiny from his contemporaries, later historians and biographers in the 20th century theorized that while Gordon may have been a latent homosexual, there is no evidence that he acted upon those desires. In his biography of Gordon, the Canadian historian Brad Fort maintains that Gordon was heterosexual but chose to remain celibate at a young age out of a sense of Christian duty. While Gordon hoped he would be posted back to China, in 1871 he was appointed to the Danube Commission tasked with surveying the waterways of the Danube Delta. In October, he left for Galati, the port town he had last seen in 1857. While he found the work rather dull, he was glad to stay with Romolo Gessi in Bucharest and enjoyed his travels throughout the Romanian countryside. After promotion to colonel in February 1872, Gordon went to the Crimea in the summer to examine the condition of the British military cemeteries on the peninsula, and on his way back in September, he stopped off at Constantinople for dinner with the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. During the dinner, Gordon spoke with Nubar Pasha, the chief minister of Egypt, who was looking for someone to become Governor-General of Equatoria, or Southern Sudan, then under Egyptian control. The incumbent, another Englishman named Sir Samuel Baker, had been unsuccessful in carrying out his instructions to suppress the slave trade along the Nile. Nubar waited until Baker completed his term before making a formal offer in October 1873, which Gordon gladly accepted. After being made a general in the Ottoman army, Gordon departed for Africa on the 28th of January 1874, his 41st birthday. In February, he arrived in Egypt and reported to the Khedive of Egypt, Ismail Pasha. Although nominally a vassal of the Ottoman Empire, since 1805 Egypt was effectively an independent state. In 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte had overthrown the Mamluk rulers of Egypt, but the following year his fleet was destroyed by Lord Nelson at the Battle of the Nile. After British and Ottoman troops expelled the French in 1801, an Ottoman general of Albanian descent named Muhammad Ali became governor of Egypt in 1805. With the Ottoman Empire in decline, Muhammad Ali and his successors, who claimed the title of Khedive or Viceroy, enjoyed considerable autonomy and aimed to expand their territories beyond Egypt, conquering Sudan in the 1820s. While the British were the primary beneficiaries of a close economic relationship with Egypt, the Khedives employed military officers and civil administrators from all over Europe, a practice encouraged by Ismail Pasha, Muhammad Ali's grandson, after becoming Khedive in 1863. In 1869, Ismail presided over the opening of the Suez Canal, a development of enormous economic benefit to Britain and Europe, reducing travel time to and from India by 2/3. Encouraged by the British, Ismail sought to expand into Central Africa to the headwaters of the Nile and the Great Lakes, which would be one of Gordon's objectives as governor of Equatoria. During his meeting with the Khedive in Cairo, the new governor was offered his predecessor's salary of £10,000 a year. When Gordon said that £2,000 would be enough, an astonished Ismail exclaimed, "What an extraordinary Englishman! He doesn't want money." After taking leave of the Khedive, Gordon made his way down the Suez Canal to the Red Sea, where he was met by Gessi, who had left Romania and taken up a commission in the Khedive's army after learning of Gordon's appointment. With Gessi at his side, Gordon arrived at the Sudanese capital of Khartoum in March, where he made the acquaintance of his immediate superior, Ismail Pasha Ayoub, the Governor-General of Sudan. He soon steamed up the Nile and in April reached the island of Gondokoro, 750 miles south of Khartoum, which would serve as the base for his efforts to crack down on the slave trade over the next 2 years. Gordon began work constructing a series of fortified outposts to assert the authority of the Egyptian government, but his campaign against the slave trade was undermined by Ayoub, who had an economic incentive to allow the trade to continue. Gordon also aimed to establish Egyptian control of the neighbouring kingdoms of Buganda and Banyoro. In 1875, he dispatched his American subordinate, Charles Chalet Long, to seek submission from King Mutesa of Buganda. Though Long was unsuccessful, he discovered a lake between Lake Victoria and Lake Albert, which he named Lake Ibrahim after Khedive Ismail's father, which was later renamed Lake Kyoga. Gordon was keen to find out whether there was a navigable route between the lakes and dispatched Gessi to circumnavigate Lake Albert. In July 1876, Gordon was leading his own expedition from Lake Albert along the Nile to Lake Kyoga when he received news that King Mutesa had taken 140 Egyptian soldiers hostage after inviting them to build a fort in his capital. Gordon responded by dispatching one of his men to negotiate an agreement with Mutesa to secure the release of the Egyptians while allowing Buganda to retain its independence. Having accomplished all he could in suppressing the slave trade in Equatoria, Gordon left in October and informed the Khedive of his intention to resign his governorship. Before returning to England for the winter, the Khedive persuaded him to reconsider, and in the absence of any new offers of employment, he returned to Egypt in February 1877. Gordon had requested the governorship of the whole of Sudan from the Khedive, which was readily granted after lobbying efforts from his friend Gerald Graham. In accordance with his newly elevated status, Gordon was awarded the honorific title of Pasha and became a field marshal in the Ottoman army. With orders from the Khedive to eradicate the slave trade and improve internal communications in Sudan, Gordon arrived at Khartoum at the beginning of May. Within weeks, he instituted a series of reforms, abolishing public flogging, disbanding the Bashi Bazouks, unpopular local Turkish militia, and placing a box at the door of the governor's palace to receive petitions from the populace. On the 19th of May, Gordon left Khartoum for the Arab-dominated western districts of Darfur and Kordofan, the heartland of the Sudanese slave trade. Gordon proposed the gradual abolition of slavery by forcing slaveholders to register their slaves by the 1st of January 1878, with complete abolition scheduled for 1889. The most powerful slave trader in Sudan was Zubair Rama, who had conquered Darfur for Egypt in 1874, but was away fighting for the Ottoman army against the Russians in Bulgaria. In his absence, Zubair's son, Suleiman, led an insurrection against the Egyptian authorities, prompting Gordon to ride out and suppress the rebellion. On the 2nd of September, Gordon and a small entourage appeared, unannounced, amongst Suleiman and his 3,000 rebels and ordered them to submit in return for positions within the Egyptian administration. Impressed by Gordon's fearlessness, 3 days later, Suleiman and a number of his subordinate chiefs agreed to withdraw. Not long after Gordon returned to Khartoum in January 1878, he was summoned to Cairo to advise the Khedive on his mounting financial problems. Ismail Pasha had spent heavily on cultural and infrastructure projects and brought Egypt to the brink of bankruptcy. Having begun his reign as Khedive with a national debt of £3 million, by 1876 the figure had risen to £81 million, and half of the country's income was being used to service interest payments to European bondholders. In 1875, the Khedive sold Egypt's 45% stake in the Suez Canal for £4 million to the British government, which increased its scrutiny of Egyptian government finances. The British and French demanded an inquiry, but refused to accommodate the Khedive's wishes for Gordon to chair it. Gordon's suggestion to suspend interest payments for a year and prioritize the pay of government officials and soldiers was dismissed by the chair of the inquiry, Major Evelyn Baring. Instead, the commission seized the Khedive's personal estates and limited his powers to that of a constitutional sovereign, with Nubar Pasha as Prime Minister. In June 1879, Ismail was pressured by the British and French to abdicate in favour of his son, Tewfik Pasha, and went into exile. Gordon had left Cairo in March 1878, and by June he was back in Khartoum to carry out administrative reforms in order to stabilise Sudan's finances. In July, he received word that Suleiman Rahma was leading another rebellion in the province of Bahr el-Ghazal, where he had been appointed vice-governor. Gordon dispatched Gessi to the southern province to suppress the rebellion, and over the next 6 months the Italian officer achieved a string of victories which weakened the rebels. After Suleiman appealed for reinforcements from Darfur and Kordofan, Gordon set out from Khartoum in March 1879, headed for Suleiman's headquarters at Shaka. Closely pursued by Gessi from the south, Suleiman retreated to Shaka, where Gordon was closing from the northeast. After meeting with Gessi at the end of June, Gordon returned to Khartoum while Gessi completed the task of capturing and executing Suleiman in the middle of July. With the elimination of Suleiman, the slave trade in Sudan was broken up. Gordon considered his mission complete and left Khartoum in August, preparing to resign. After an ill-fated attempt at the end of the year to negotiate a border dispute with the King of Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, Gordon tendered his resignation to Khedive Tewfik in January 1880 and returned to England. After 5 years in Africa, the exhausted Gordon decided to spend 2 months resting in Switzerland. By the time he returned to England in April, he had received an offer from King Leopold II of Belgium to serve as Viceroy of the Belgian Congo, as well as another to become Governor of Cape Colony in South Africa. In May, Gordon accepted an appointment as Private Secretary to the new Viceroy of India, the Marquis of Ripon, but submitted his resignation within a couple of days of his arrival at Mumbai. Almost immediately, Gordon was invited to China by Sir Robert Hart, a British diplomat who had served as the head of China's customs service since 1863. China and Russia were on the brink of war over the northwestern province of Xinjiang, and Gordon was asked to advise the Chinese government on military preparations. Fearing that Gordon would take command of a Chinese army against Russia, the British government ordered him to stay put in Hong Kong. After ignoring the order, Gordon indicated that he was prepared to resign from the British Army rather than abandon China. When he arrived in Beijing in August, Gordon urged the Chinese ministers to seek a diplomatic solution, warning that the Russian Pacific Fleet would seize Tianjin and threaten the capital. The Chinese rejected the advice, but after Gordon returned to England, the Treaty of St. Petersburg was signed in early 1881, avoiding war. Following his return to England in October 1880, Gordon embarked on a 2-week tour of Ireland, where he witnessed the appalling destitution of the Irish peasantry. The experience prompted him to write a memo to the Liberal Prime Minister William Gladstone in favour of land reform in Ireland, proposing that the government buy out the Anglo-Irish landlords and divide their estates among the poor tenant farmers. After spending the early months of 1881 in London, in May, Gordon was appointed commander of the Royal Engineers on the island of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean, which had been a British imperial possession since the Napoleonic Wars. After arriving in late June, he spent over a month inspecting the island's defences, as well as those of the Seychelles to the north. He was so impressed by the beauty of the islands that he proposed it as the location of the biblical Garden of Eden. In August, Gordon wrote up his Memorandum on Colonial Defences, setting out his views not only on Mauritius and its surrounding islands, but the whole question of imperial defence. He argued that southern Africa was more important than the Suez Canal for control of India, since the canal could be blocked by a single sunken ship. He also recommended that Mauritius and the Seychelles should be split into separate colonies, a suggestion that was eventually adopted in 1903. Not long after his promotion to Major General in March 1882, Gordon was ordered to South Africa, where he served as an advisor to the government of the Cape Colony over its relationship with the small kingdom of Basutoland, modern-day Lesotho. After arriving in Basutoland in September, he began negotiations, but after being caught up in a struggle between rival brothers who claimed the throne, Gordon fell out with the Cape government and sailed home in October. Following a short stay in England, he decided to travel to the Holy Land and arrived in Jerusalem in January 1883. Ever since he had embraced Christianity, Gordon hoped to visit the holy sites associated with the life of Christ. He was particularly interested in determining the location of Golgotha, the site of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. He rejected the theory that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre had been built on the site, and instead pointed to a site further north, beyond the Damascus Gate, named Skull Hill, at the foot of which is a rock tomb known as the Garden Tomb. After Gordon advanced this theory in his book Reflections in Palestine, published the following year, the site was given the nickname Gordon's Calvary. After relocating to the Mediterranean port of Jaffa, Gordon received an offer from King Leopold to serve in the Congo. Having previously declined the appointment, Gordon accepted the Belgian offer and arrived in Brussels on New Year's Day 1884. After meeting Leopold and agreeing to depart for the Congo in early February, Gordon returned to England to formally resign his commission from the British Army. However, his plans would change dramatically due to recent developments in Egypt and Sudan. Following the deposition of Ismail Pasha, Egypt had effectively become a British vassal. Many Egyptians protested against European rule, and in February 1882, Colonel Ahmed Urabi led a revolt demanding equality for the Egyptians and a parliamentary government. With the revolt engulfing the whole country, Khedive Tewfik invited Urabi into his cabinet, and by July he had effectively become prime minister after the Khedive fled to Alexandria, then under French protection. After anti-Christian riots in Alexandria prompted the French fleet to leave, the Royal Navy bombarded the Egyptian port, and in September, an army commanded by Gordon's friend General Garnet Wolseley decisively defeated Urabi's forces at the Battle of Tel el-Kebir and marched into Cairo to restore the Khedive. Although the Urabi revolt had been suppressed, a larger revolt was underway in Sudan, led by the religious leader Muhammad Ahmed, who proclaimed himself the Mahdi, an Islamic Messiah. In the summer of 1883, the British advisors to the Khedive organized an army of 8,000 Egyptians under the command of Colonel William Hicks to defeat the Mahdi. After being lured into Kordofan in early November, Hicks confronted the Mahdi's army of 40,000 men at the Battle of Shekan, near the town of El Obeid. The Egyptians were annihilated, and fewer than 500 survived the battle, while Hicks had his head cut off and placed on a spike at the Mahdi's headquarters at El Obeid. The humiliating defeat left the Mahdi in control of almost the whole of Sudan, prompting the British and Egyptian governments to make the decision to abandon the garrisons in Sudan and evacuate all the Europeans and Egyptians who wanted to leave. On the 4th of January 1884, while still in Brussels, Gordon received a letter from Sir Garnet Wolseley urging him not to go to the Congo and inviting him for a discussion at the War Office about the situation in Sudan. On the 8th of January, the day after his return to England, Gordon spoke to W.T. Stead, the editor of the Pall Mall Gazette. After initial reservations, he began to share his views about the Sudan crisis. He argued that the Mahdi's popularity was due to poor governance by the Egyptian authorities and did not believe his supporters were primarily motivated by his religious message. He criticized the government's evacuation announcement, which he considered counterproductive to morale in the areas of Sudan that remained loyal to the Egyptian government, and warned that failure to eliminate the Mahdi would cause the uprising to spread to Egypt. He proposed that Sir Samuel Baker and his brother Colonel Valentine Baker should be sent to Egypt to rescue the situation. Stead took a few liberties in his reporting, and the article came out on the 9th under the headline, "Chinese Gordon for the Sudan," making Gordon the popular choice for the mission. On the 15th of January, Gordon met Wolseley at the War Office, where the latter proposed sending Gordon to Sudan to report on the military situation there, provided Sir Evelyn Baring, the British Consul General in Cairo, approved of his appointment. On the 16th, Gordon went to Brussels, but was recalled to London the following day by Wolseley with news that Baring had agreed to his assignment. After an uncomfortable meeting informing the Belgian king that he was obliged to answer the call of his country, but would happily go to the Congo afterwards, Gordon arrived in England on the morning of the 18th. From his country estate at Harden, Gladstone believed that Gordon's role was merely to advise the government on what should be done, and the government was not bound by his recommendations. However, when he met with 4 cabinet ministers on the 18th, Gordon was informed that he was to organise the evacuation himself. Although the ministers had reservations about appointing a man to lead an operation he opposed, the government felt it had no choice other than to agree to the demands of public opinion and to send Gordon back to Sudan. That evening, Gordon left London and arrived at the Egyptian port of Port Said on the 24th of January. He had planned to sail down the Suez Canal and head to Khartoum immediately, but was persuaded by Baring and Gerald Graham to call on the Khedive in Cairo, where he was reappointed Governor-General of Sudan. While in the Egyptian capital, Gordon met Zubair Rahma, the former slave boss whose son had been executed on Gordon's orders 5 years earlier. Despite their disagreements, Gordon believed that Zubair could reactivate his tribal networks and challenge the Mahdi's control of Sudan. At a meeting with Baring and Egyptian officials on the 26th of January, Gordon proposed taking Zubair with him to Khartoum, but the request was denied. That same night, a disappointed Gordon left Cairo and arrived at Khartoum on the 18th of February. Gordon's instructions from Baring were to save lives and property while establishing some rough form of government which will prevent anarchy and confusion. On his way to Khartoum, Gordon's mood swung between optimism and pessimism, confident that the Mahdi's hold on Sudan could be easily broken, but regretting that Zubair was not available to help him restore order. At a gathering of local leaders in the northern Sudanese town of Berber a few days before his arrival in Khartoum, Gordon made public the Khedive's proclamation of Sudan's independence and the evacuation of the Egyptian army. Gordon hoped that this would encourage the Sudanese leaders to accept his authority with the promise of self-government afterwards, but instead, the Sudanese felt abandoned and defected to the Mahdi, the exact outcome he had predicted during his interview with Stead in January. Following this setback, Gordon changed tack and wrote to the Mahdi, offering to make him Sultan of Kordofan under his authority as Governor-General. Unsurprisingly, the Mahdi reacted with contempt and sent back a reply asking Gordon to convert to Islam. After his previous doubts about the religious nature of the Mahdi's uprising, it was becoming increasingly clear that the Mahdi and his followers were fighting an Islamic jihad. Gordon received a rapturous welcome upon his arrival at Khartoum, a city of more than 40,000, including a garrison of 9,000 men. Gordon ordered the city gates to be opened, burned debt records, and freed the prisoners. In late February, Gordon began evacuating women and children from Khartoum down the Nile in government steamers. He entrusted the defense of the city to local Sudanese troops rather than the unreliable Egyptians or the hated Turkish militia. In late February, he sent a telegram to Bering in Cairo, informing him of Stuart's expedition to attack rebels to ensure the evacuation could carry on unhindered. However, when the message reached London, Gordon created the impression that he was taking matters into his own hands and planned to fight the Mahdi. In the meantime, Gordon continued to ask permission for Zubair to join him in Khartoum, and Bering eventually agreed. However, when the news reached London, the government bowed to pressure from the Anti-Slavery Society and decided to keep Zubair in Cairo. In response to this final refusal in early March, Gordon informed Bering that it would be impossible to establish a stable government in Sudan and proposed to leave things up to the Egyptians after the evacuation was complete. By ending the message, "If Egypt is to be quiet, Mahdi must be smashed up," Gordon once again gave the impression to London that he was planning to do battle with the Mahdi. After successfully evacuating 2,500 civilians from Khartoum, by the middle of March, the Mahdi's men began to lay siege to the city and cut off Gordon's telegraph line. While Gordon was increasingly isolated in Khartoum, a revolt had broken out in eastern Sudan among the Hadendoa tribe, led by Osman Digna. In early February, Colonel Valentine Baker's 3,000 Egyptians were defeated at El Teb by 1,000 Hadendoa warriors, whom the British nicknamed Fuzzy Wuzzies, whilst throughout the conflict the Mahdist forces were known pejoratively as dervishes. A second army of British and Egyptian soldiers commanded by Gerald Graham defeated Digna and sought to advance to Berber and Khartoum to link up with Gordon. But the British government ordered Graham to return to Egypt after insisting that Gordon was free to leave Khartoum whenever he wanted. However, by the 12th of March, thousands of Mahdists approached from the north, leaving Gordon surrounded. With limited food and money, Gordon attempted to keep morale high with regular displays from military bands, and he continued to inspect the garrison and its defences every morning. The Mahdi and the bulk of his army was besieging Berber, and the Mahdists outside Khartoum were only 6,000 strong. Gordon and the garrison still had a good chance of breaking out of Khartoum, but he was unwilling to surrender the city and determined to resist until the British government sent a relief force. After the Mahdi captured Berber in May, all escape routes out of Khartoum were blocked. The British government, believing that Gordon had blundered into the situation himself, resisted calls to send a relief force. While Gladstone expressed a degree of sympathy for the Mahdists in the House of Commons and claimed they are struggling rightly to be free, Queen Victoria urged the Prime Minister to take action. Garnet Wolseley was once again the loudest voice for action, and in early August the government finally authorised Wolseley to lead an expedition, recognising that national honour was at stake and something had to be done. Wolseley arrived in Cairo in early September, but it was not until the 27th that his relief force of 5,400 men was equipped to leave the Egyptian capital and advance up the Nile. Meanwhile, in early September, Gordon sent Stewart and Power on a mission down the Nile to re-establish communications with Bering in Egypt. Their steamer ran aground, and after going ashore, the men were soon ambushed and murdered. Gordon did not learn of their fate until late October, when the Mahdi set up camp across the river near Omdurman at the head of an army of some 50,000 men. By December, supplies in Khartoum were running perilously low, and Gordon wrote in his journal that the city might fall if the relief force did not arrive in 10 days. Mentally exhausted, Gordon refused offers from the Mahdi for safe passage out of the city and seemed to prepare himself for martyrdom, even if help were to arrive. Wolseley had expected to reach Khartoum in early November, but progress upriver was painfully slow. In early January 1885, he divided his army into 2 columns, sending 1,400 men, mostly from the Camel Corps, to take the most direct route to Khartoum by crossing the desert, while the remainder of the force continued upriver. On the 17th of January, the Desert Column encountered a force of 14,000 Mahdists at Abu Klea, but managed to overcome them with minimal casualties. The column repelled a further attack a couple of days later at Abu Kru, once again inflicting heavy casualties on the enemy, but at the cost of more than 100 dead, including its commander, Major General Herbert Stewart. His inexperienced successor, Sir Charles Wilson, was overly cautious and wasted crucial time by reorganizing his forces and choosing to lead a reconnaissance mission to Khartoum at the head of 20 British soldiers and over 100 Egyptians. Through his telescope, Gordon was able to see the displays of mourning in the Mahdi's camp for the men killed at Abu Klea and Abu Kru, and gained heart that the relief force was not far away. A week later, anticipating that Wolseley's men would arrive any day, the Mahdi prepared to launch his final attack on Khartoum. The receding waters of the Nile exposed a narrow strip of land leading to the city walls, and on the morning of the 26th, the Mahdist army attacked and soon overcame Khartoum's weakened defences, killing 10,000 civilians and soldiers of the garrison over the course of the day. Although the Mahdi had issued strict orders not to kill him, Gordon died during the first hour of fighting at the staircase in the northwest of the Governor-General's palace. There is no consensus about how he died, but his contemporaries preferred the image of him calmly descending the staircase, unarmed, wearing his ceremonial uniform as Governor-General and the red fez of an Ottoman pasha. The Irish painter George William Joy's iconic painting of the death of Gordon depicts the general standing at the top of the staircase in his fez and British redcoat with a spear pointing at him. Other eyewitnesses recount him defending himself with his revolver and sword before finally being cut down. Gordon's head was cut off and presented to the Mahdi, while his body was thrown down a well. 2 days later, on the 28th of January, on what would have been Gordon's 52nd birthday, Charles Wilson and his small party arrived to survey the ruins of Khartoum and promptly turned back. After the news of Gordon's death and the fall of Khartoum reached London, the press blamed Gladstone, labelling him the murderer of Gordon by reversing the initials of his nickname of Grand Old Man. Following his death, Gordon was celebrated in England as a Christian martyr who died a noble death defending the faith against Islam. Charles George Gordon was the fifth generation of his family to serve in the British Army, but the manner of his death at Khartoum made him the most famous of them all. His drawing and surveying skills made him an excellent engineer officer, and after serving with distinction in the Crimea, his skills were often employed by the British government in surveying international borders. In his late 20s, he shot to fame as the commander of the ever-victorious army in China, and his small force made an outsized contribution to the suppression of the Taiping Rebellion in 1864. His strongly held Christian beliefs created a sense of honesty and integrity within him which astonished Li Hongxiang in China and later on Khedive Ismail in Egypt. His Christian faith inspired him to spend much time and money on charitable activities for the poor local children during his 6 years at Gravesend. The final decade of Gordon's life is primarily associated with Egypt and Sudan. In the service of the Khedive of Egypt, Gordon successfully suppressed the slave trade in Sudan, initially in Equatoria and later in the whole of Sudan. After spending the next few years hopping between India, China, Mauritius, South Africa and the Middle East, Gordon returned to Sudan for what would be his final assignment. Having criticized Gladstone's decision to abandon Sudan to the Mahdi, Gordon attempted to evacuate Khartoum while trying to make arrangements for a stable government in opposition to the Mahdi. A combination of Gordon's stubbornness in choosing to remain in the city and the British government's unwillingness to rescue him created the conditions for his death on the staircase in his palace in January 1885 after a siege of more than 300 days, transforming him into a martyr for Christianity and the British Empire. What do you think of Gordon of Khartoum? Was he a brave and talented soldier who could inspire his men to great deeds on the battlefield, or was he a military adventurer who was prone to disobeying his orders and getting himself into trouble? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.